The physical world is a reflection of the psychic world. Sometimes you'll hear in some theosophical places and other mystical places that the aura, the psychic world is a reflection of the physical world. Actually, he corrects that. It's in his wonderful transmission, Meditation for This Age. The physical world is the reflection.
I see.
But it's not nothing. Now, if you go back, this is one of my favorite topics, as a matter of fact. If you go way back into the ancient Hindu yogic philosophy, and even some things since, they had the word maya, and they called it a delusion.
Yeah.
And one can be deluded about it. A materialist is deluded into thinking that that's all there is. That's a delusion. But material things are, I think, a much better way is the Mars Sector 6 way of putting it. It's a reflection. It's not really a delusion, but it's only a reflection.
Yes, it's putting it in its right place,
so
actually.
Does it, coming to your question, do material things matter in spiritual things and in the spiritual world?
Yeah.
Absolutely, they do matter.
The Spiritual Freedom Show with Richard Lawrence, where politics is not the answer, materialism counts for nothing, and spirituality will set you free.
Richard.
Darren.
So I've got a, kind of a universal one here today. I think one that probably a lot of people think about. And it's, whether material things matter in any way on the spiritual path. I think it can be quite a confusing topic in some way for people who are on the spiritual path, mainly because, the conventional wisdom is that, well, in the past at least, is to completely detach yourself from all material things, material desires as well, and to not engage with them at all. But, certainly in today's world, in light of the cosmic teachings we've been given, what we learn in the 9 freedoms, is that really right now? And was it ever?
Good question, and I'm very glad you asked that. I had no idea what you were going to ask, and I'm glad you asked that, because we do say at the beginning of the show, or our announcer,
True.
Lisa Rossa says, where materialism counts for nothing. And what we're talking about there is materialism, not material things.
Yeah.
Materialism
That's
is
the distinction.
Yes,
Okay,
is the belief, really,
yeah.
that the only thing that exists, the only thing that's real is material things.
Yeah.
And that counts for nothing for us, because obviously there's far more to it than that. And as a matter of fact, it's brilliantly explained by the great intelligence who gave the 9 freedoms that the physical world is a reflection of the psychic world. Sometimes you'll hear in some theosophical places and other mystical places that the aura, the psychic world is a reflection of the physical world. Actually, he corrects that. It's in his wonderful transmission, Meditation for This Age. The physical world is the reflection.
I see.
But it's not nothing. Now, if you go back, this is one of my favorite topics, as a matter of fact. If you go way back into the ancient Hindu yogic philosophy, and even some things since, they had the word maya, and they called it a delusion.
Yeah.
And, one can be deluded about it. A materialist is deluded into thinking that that's all there is. That's a delusion. But material things are, I think, a much better way is the Mars Sector 6 way of putting it. It's a reflection. It's not really a delusion, but it's only a reflection.
Yes, it's putting it in its right place,
so
actually.
Does
it,
coming to your question, do material things matter in spiritual things and in the spiritual world?
Yeah.
Absolutely, they do matter. Simple answer to a simple question. They matter, yes.
Yeah, and that's quite a surprising answer in a way, if you just sort of you just see it on face value.
Yeah, a lot will say they don't.
Yeah. But as you say, well, let's get into that, because obviously, what we're saying is the dogma of materialism, which is the belief, as you described, that that there's nothing more to life.
There's no God.
Exactly.
There's no aura. There is no psychic ability. There's no intuition. There's no higher powers. That's a killer.
Right. And patently false. We know that.
Because it stops your progress.
Yeah.
And the idea even that material things are the most important things in life is also wrong.
Right.
They certainly aren't.
Right.
But do they matter? Absolutely, they do matter.
Yeah. And I guess where kind of like the subtlety comes in, and where I'd like to explore on the show, is sort of, what we're talking about is achieving material things as an end in and of themselves is obviously where it goes wrong. But taking care of material needs, which are necessary in order to for you to live and ultimately to facilitate the spiritual work that you may be doing.
There's a proviso, if I may jump in.
Oh, yeah.
Unless you're going to use those material things in service.
Right.
And material service isn't the most important service that can be given at the moment, and that's mainly because there's a lot of people who are much more willing to give material service than spiritual service. But it can be an enabler of spiritual service. I mean, if you just take the Ethereal as an example, and you take the missions that we do, and I'll just name check them. Some people, forgive me, won't be familiar with these, but Operation Sunbeam, Operation Prayer Power, Operation Space Power, they require funding. They don't make any money at all. They wouldn't happen without that funding. So it's that important. It's a key element. The funding alone wouldn't make it happen. I mean, it's one thing you can't do with money. You can't buy spiritual dedication. You can't find a spiritually dedicated person just with money. So it has its limits. That person, that spiritually dedicated person, has to find that inner flame and to dedicate them. You can't buy that. But it has its place. It's not the main thing, but it's a vital thing.
I can see that it's, given where we live and how it works, it's just necessary to make some things possible.
Just the obvious things. I mean, physical health matters. Without it, we are very limited in what we can do for others. And obviously living and being able to live in an area which is perhaps more expensive, like some people choose to live in London, like you do. It'd be much cheaper for you to go and live in certain other parts of the UK, much cheaper. But you couldn't do what you do if you did.
Totally. And in that way, it's sort of like it's a necessary thing in order to make that.
And by that I mean you couldn't do what you do in spiritual service if you did. That's what I meant.
Totally. There are other elements where this sort of like impacts on the way that we think about the way we live our life, and of the way that we looking at society around us as well, and trying to sort of orient our own compass to determine that's not right, that is right, etc. I mean, I was asked the other day by someone like, okay, so someone's become very wealthy. Let's ignore, let's just put aside for the moment how they might have done that. But do they have a right to spend that money however they wish? And I thought that was, I can share what I thought, but I mean, I just...
No, share what you think.
Well, I just thought, of course they do, but given the state
Legally
of the world...
they do.
Of course, given the state of the world at
Man's
the moment...
law.
Given the state of the world at the moment, and, the nature of the suffering is that, what kind of person are you? If
morally they don't, and karmically it would be very difficult for them. And it's very hard. Somebody who dies wealthy, pending how, of course, I'm going to put a proviso again there, how they leave their will, to be blunt, or their legacy, is very unlikely to go to a higher realm, very, very high realm. Possibly not even a high realm at all.
I see,
because it does matter, because of what they could do. Now, on the plus side, and I was talking to somebody actually only yesterday about this, this is a person who has made massive sacrifices, but had wealth. He inherited wealth, actually, and he made some money, but he's used it brilliantly, this person. And he is actually quite poor now. He hasn't indulged himself at all. Some people will give money, but they'll also indulge themselves, and they'll have all kinds of luxuries as well. And they have the right, whether it's right.
That's a nice way to put it.
It's a different point. But this person hasn't. Now, I believe this person will place himself in very, very good stead. And you could even be a person, depending again who you are, where the most useful thing you could do would be to give money. But as I told him, and even to make money, to give it towards a spiritual cause, where it's going to be used in a spiritual way. But as I told him, a lot of people say, well, if I had money, I'd do this, I'd do that, I'd do what you did. It means nothing, really. It means very little. It's a nice thought. We don't know whether they really would if they were in that position for a start. And also, they're not in that position. They haven't put themselves into that karmic position, whereas this person did and used it. As I say, he's not exactly poor now, but he's got very little. He's got enough for him and his dependents, to live okay, fine. But he's really gone the extra mile. You know, I always remind people, because a lot of people just don't know this bit of history, that whatever people think about Christianity, one of its great proponents was St. Paul. And I know some people don't like him because of sexist reasons that they perceive around his writings, or whatever it might be. But whatever you think, let's just look at what he actually did, which was after his conversion, Damascene conversion. He worked relentlessly and at great cost to himself and at risk to himself, traveling the world, spreading, possibly with the exception of St. Peter, I don't know this, but possibly Christianity far and wide more than anyone, to all communities, even though he was from a very strict Orthodox Jewish background himself. He went out of his way to reach other peoples, which some early Christians didn't like, by the way. And it's said, for example, that the brother of Jesus, who was called James, not the Saint James, but not the disciple James, but another James, didn't like it, so they say. But he did it. He went out, he traveled around into hostile environments. But the point I want to make here, while he did it, he was working. A lot of people don't know that. He didn't have funding. He was a tent maker. He had to go to a place where he could make tents and then give out the message.
I see.
I've always found, you know...
So practical as well.
Yeah, in some of the Eastern traditions, where the sannyasin, the chela, was focused on their own development and their own enlightenment and ultimately their own nirvana, if they got it right and went far enough, that was their aim. And then they would have a begging bowl. They'd be encouraged to do that in order to... And they'd live off what they could beg for. Yeah, I can see a rationale, the idea being it's really a blessing upon the community that gives them the food they need in their begging bowl. I can see that concept, but I find it unsatisfactory myself. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. That's just me.
That approach.
That approach.
Yeah, okay.
I think the stand on your own 2 feet with material things, which certainly Dr. George King did, and he, you know, right from the beginning, one of the first things he had to do when he started out as primary terrestrial mental channel was to get rid of or dispose of his material assets and be virtually penniless. And he had some things at the time that he'd earned and worked for, and he had to go with very little money on a very tight budget, particularly then he went to America. But he did it, and he wasn't that interested in material things, actually. It was very hard to get him to spend money on himself, to buy clothes, to, you know, go on a nice holiday. We didn't like holidays much anyway. Didn't really believe in them much. But, you know, he wasn't he had some equipment of different kinds. He liked his stereo in those days and things, but he wasn't a big spender at all on himself, and he wasn't very interested in material things. But point is, though, he did stand on his own 2 feet. And, you know, if people make donations to a great cause, a worthy cause, freely, I don't mean like allegedly some organizations that are said to be cults, which go out and try and get their people to give them 6-figure sums in order to learn the next initiation. I'm not talking about that at all. And that was one particular organization that's massive money maker. I haven't looked into it, but it's said to be, you know, worth billions. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who freely make donations, material donations. It's very, very good for their karma to do that. They shouldn't be, it shouldn't be demanded of them. They shouldn't be required of them. But it's certainly very good for them.
Yeah, I can see that. And actually, there's other aspects of that too, isn't there? Because if you have put yourself in a position where you have the money, either you've inherited or you've made it or whatever, and then you've chosen to use it in that way, essentially to help others, to help the world, the world in some way. I mean, in that way, you are exhibiting almost like a mastery over this system to some extent, rather than being a slave of this system, where most people are, chasing material things for greater pleasure or in some way, and they're making it an end in and of themselves, and they're sort of stuck in the system, so to speak. But here we have someone who's earned it or received it, but is then giving it out again freely, as you describe, in order to help another person, not kind of deluded by the dogma of this materialism.
You do, and you get the anti-money approach in some spiritual movements, sort of an anti-money approach. So there's this biblical quote: "It's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than a camel to walk through the eye of a needle," I think is the quote. And I think that's true in essence, by the way, if, as I said earlier, that rich man doesn't leave their wealth to a great cause, they just die rich and leave it, for people that they may love, but who don't particularly need that much money anyway, whereas they could have saved numerous lives with it, that sort of thing. I think that's true. But what we don't look at is the positive. Let's look at the positive. If you are a rich person who uses your money, and there's the person I mentioned who I was talking to yesterday, has used it in their life, which is even better, not just in their will, but in their life.
Yes, totally.
And they are now relatively poor, actually. And that's a phrase he used to me yesterday. He's got enough, but he's relatively poor compared to what he did have. He'll be very well placed indeed, as will his wife, who was in 100% agreement with everything he did in this regard. And as I say, one shouldn't be silly. I mean, they are looked after, they're fine, they've got what they need, but that's all they've got. And they will be well placed. So just as someone could go to a low realm if they misuse money or don't use money, which is a misuse as well. Don't use it spiritually.
Yes, totally,
If you do use it well, you must go up after your passing. I would say, that's an opinion of mine, but I would say you must surely go to a higher realm than you would otherwise have gone to. I'd be very confident of that.
It's almost just logical, isn't it, that would be the case.
Yeah.
I think there's some other interesting elements of this as well, which is that ultimately, when you think about it, materialism is a dead end anyway. You know what I mean? It's not even like, what are you really giving up?
Oh yes,
yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, people have done numerous research into this and surveys and found that rich people aren't necessarily more happy. And rich people, I'm talking super rich people, get terribly distressed by minutiae, materialistic minutiae, like if there's a crease in their bedding, that the maid didn't, had a crease in their sheet, or there's a tiny speck of dust on a banister. This can be terribly upsetting to some of them. Well, this isn't balance. Yeah, you don't want dust on your banister.
That's so ridiculous.
But it's ridiculous, but it's apparently true. And people who've worked with the super rich will tell incredible stories about how upset and distressed. And this is a result of attachment, and in that way, the old teachings were completely correct.
Yes,
and the idea behind the big begging bowl, by the way, was correct. Gives the individual with the begging bowl detachment from material things. It's a very brave step. I'm not taking away from that. Those sannyasins, they forewent, family life. They forewent marriage. I don't think that was completely necessary, had it been a spiritual marriage, but they did. They forewent material things, and all they had was their begging bowl and their little room or whatever they had to do their meditation in, and they lived very modestly. And this meant they were detached from those things. This is the concept, and they could move to spiritual things. All that is true. I just think there's something lacking, that, in my own humble opinion, be better to stand on your own 2 feet, as some monasteries have done in history, of course. Of course, some of them were wealth centres, actually, in medieval days, but that's going the other way. But, they would grow their own crops and feed themselves and do whatever was necessary materially. And of course, you need material things if you're going to provide welfare for others.
Yes.
And if you're going to run, as we do, non-profit making, money losing missions for the benefit of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings out the aspect, which is that, it's not just about detachment, it's about mastery. So, to have immense resources, but to be completely detached from, the delusion of what that is, and to be using it in, a noble way, as we describe, to help the world in all or etc. That's really, I think, where you would want to be. It's like it's not that you just like you separate yourself from it, almost like I can't trust myself with it. I'm detaching from that, or the most generous reading would be that you're detached from that and don't need it, and you've risen above it as you described. But wouldn't it be better if you could amass it for a great purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a couple of examples actually too, in terms of the dissemination of truth. Now, I've written a number of books which have been published by publishers, and that's a great thing, really, if you can do it, because it will reach. They have the access to reach more people,
Sure.
and one of my books became an international bestseller, and so forth. That's all good.
Yeah.
But if you have a particular core teaching to deliver, it's not always good, because on the whole, publishers will have a remit, and you can't blame them. They are a commercial operation,
Sure.
and they will have editors, and they will want something, particularly if it's not fiction, it's fact-based book. I don't know actually about fiction, it might apply there, it might not. Unless you're a really super big author, they will want to sort of say, well, I don't want too many mentions of Dr. George King. That's been said to me. In every book I've published outside, I don't know about every, but many of the books I've had published outside, there's been a remit. Actually, the UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message, the last book I had published by an outside publisher, Seco Books, they didn't. They didn't interfere with one word of that book at all.
Okay.
But on the whole, and by then I was a best-selling author.
Yeah.
But on the whole, they will. Now, if you take a book like The King Who Came to Earth, the biography of Dr. George King, which is the most important book I've ever been involved in authoring. Certainly not the best-selling by any manner of means, but the most important, I think, because it was about Dr. King. Now, you couldn't get that book published without giving it a slant, and removing a lot of the material in it, removing a lot of the pictures and the true accounts of Dr. King that would satisfy, I think, an outside publisher at this time in our history.
Yeah, got it.
How was that done? By donations. Some, and not all by rich people. Some of them were small amounts.
Yeah.
That book is a beautiful book. I'm just talking about not the writing of it, but that's a matter of anyone's opinion, but not mine.
Yeah.
That's up to them. But the way it's presented in an unlimited way. It's a beautiful book with lovely photos and so forth, and all the material we wanted in it. It's quite a long book, thoroughly indexed. This isn't a commercial plug. I'm just saying, I mean, by the way, I don't take any royalties at all, and nor did my co-author Brian Kniep, and I've never taken, and I would never take any royalties. Dr. King himself never took any royalties he didn't take any royalties from this book, The Nine Freedoms, that were published by the Aetherius Society or Aetherius Press. But it was a result of people giving money. Now, if all those people had been completely detached from money and didn't care about material things and therefore had nothing to offer, they just were going about their way with a begging bowl or the equivalent, that book wouldn't be published now.
Exactly. It's a great example. Yeah, great example. Exactly. If they hadn't done the work, hadn't put themselves in a position, we wouldn't have the resources to be able to do that. Put that.
That's just
out.
one example.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of points I'd like to get into.
Before I leave that, I'll just go to a historical example, if I may, which is the music of Wagner. Some of that, the later works, would not have been produced and performed, certainly in the way they were, without the sponsorship of a particular, I think, Bavarian prince.
Oh, really?
Who completely funded Wagner. He never had any money, Wagner, throughout most of his life, and then suddenly this Bavarian prince became obsessed with his music, and then he was able to produce what he wanted. Now, some of the stuff that he did at the end of his life, he'd been working on for decades, I believe.
Wow.
The ring cycle, I think. But it could, and I might have my details wrong there, but I know that a lot of his later works, whether it was the ring cycle, I couldn't say, I think it was, but it's certainly some of his well-known works, like Parsifal and so on, were all done in that period where he was sponsored. It was entirely a result of donation. And I mentioned in a previous show the example of Berlioz. I'm sorry to keep bringing up music, it's just my background. Had this dream, but he couldn't write the music because he had to go to work. If he'd had more money, or somebody had sponsored him,
Yeah.
we'd have had that work, which he always said was just, he always regretted not this music given to him in a dream, and he didn't write it down because he had to go to work.
Yeah, it really makes the point putting those two examples side by side, isn't it? Because there, in the second case, we've lost something. We've all lost something, actually, haven't we? Yeah. By him not being in a position to be able to write that down. There was a couple, just going back to my point a moment ago, the couple of things I just wanted to bring in here, because I think they're sort of the psychological elements, I think, that affect people, which is that, to be attached to material things is almost, a very negative affirmation in terms of what it's telling yourself. Yeah. That you are dependent on these outside aspects in order to be enough in some way. And the things people buy in the house and the car, whatever, which are all kind of like making us feel better about ourselves. What is that saying about ourselves? That we are not enough without them? That we will never.
It's a pathetic, in my opinion, compensation. And another thing I've noticed is that I don't know loads of rich people, but some very rich people don't think they're rich. They've got maybe a yacht, but they don't have a plane.
I think the final one there as well is that ultimately if we have this concept of possession, and we have the trying to accumulate amass for ourselves, but really as an end in and of itself, and for the the purchase of more and more things. What is it really saying about our own degree of realization, in terms of the fact that we are really all one, and that we're taking from another aspect of ourselves, but we don't see it that way. It's
the key, and it's in here, and it's in the seventh freedom, transmutation.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not so much about detachment. Detachment's necessary as a process, certainly, but ultimately it's about transmutation.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's about transmuting the delusions of materialism.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's about using money to transmute the basic aspects, the selfish aspects of the accumulation of wealth by giving it and using it for a great cause. Because now we're in the path not of transmigration, which it's in the seventh freedom, we talked about it many times, which is kind of a detachment.
Yes.
That's not enough. Even matter. I'll never forget that statement, and we found it when researching for a spiritual freedom show by Dr. King. Even a galaxy cannot go back to God as a galaxy, has to transmute all the matter within it. And a galaxy, and I know we're going off here a lot, but doesn't even have to exist. It only exists to serve. It could be in divinity. It's agreeing to be a galaxy. Yeah. And the people who are looking for dark matter and dark energy and what they are, that's the first place they should try to look, is the existence of the galaxy that's holding everything together within it. As a living thing. That's where, again, the people who are looking at dark matter and dark energy, they're only looking at the material aspect. Science, on the whole, only looks at the material aspect. As we go into the new age, it'll have to look beyond the material aspect, and it's still a science. Yes. But it's a spiritual science.
Exactly. I think what you've highlighted there is, that the principle that you've elucidated with the galaxy is exactly, we should let that trickle down to our own lives and think about what that means. Yeah. And what that means in terms of, transmuting all matter affects the way that we think about this materialism versus material things that are necessary, and using them in order to raise everything up in the way of service.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody's down here. Thanks for tuning into the show. Now, if you enjoyed that episode, don't forget to subscribe for more wisdom from the 9 Freedoms. If you'd like to find out more about the 9 Freedoms, about Mars Sector 6 by Dr. George King, go to our website, that's aetherius.org. Richard and I love hearing from you, receiving your comments, your questions on your spiritual experiences, and talking about them on the show. So do write to us, share them with us at spiritualfreedom@richardlawrence.co.uk. Always remember that service is the jewel in the rock of attainment. See you next time.